My name is Haley Monroe, 34 years old, and I currently teach literature at a small college in the state of New Hampshire. People often say that a gentle, quiet woman is a happy woman. I used to believe that, until the night of my 10-year wedding anniversary. In the candlelit banquet room, in front of more than 40 guests including friends, business partners, and both families, my husband Ethan stood up, raised his glass and laughed. 10 years beside a useless person who only reads books, he said as if it were a charming joke. Everyone laughed awkwardly, eyes avoiding contact. And me? I stood up, tucked my chair back slightly, stepped to the center of the room, then placed a thick file on the oak banquet table. How funny, Ethan, I replied, voice steady. Because with this paper, your house, your company, and your reputation will turn to ash tonight. Have you ever lived in a marriage where the person beside you always thinks you're stupid? You ever been underestimated to the point that they reveal all their secrets right in front of you? If this story makes your heart ache, leave a comment below, hit like and subscribe to support me. Because what happened after that statement made the room even quieter than the sound of a crystal glass cracking on the floor. I used to think true love could endure everything, silence, waiting. When I entered marriage with Ethan, I brought with me an inner world full of poetry, simple dreams, and the belief that with sincerity, differences would gradually blend over time. I am a literature instructor at a community college in the suburbs of New Hampshire. My lectures revolve around Shakespeare. Ethan was different. He studied finance, built his business from nothing, and had a will as sharp as a blade. 7 months after we first met, we married. At that time, I dreamed of a home full of books, hot tea, and evenings of conversation by the fireplace. But very early on, I realized Ethan did not share the same concept of home. He founded a real estate company in Boston and threw himself into work like a man obsessed. While I taught in the mornings and graded papers late into the night, Ethan rarely asked me a single question about my classroom. Whenever I excitedly shared something about my class, his gaze would be distant as if I were prattling. One evening after dinner, I told Ethan about a student who had quoted Emily Dickinson in an essay in a moving way. I remember smiling as I read the line aloud, "I'm nobody, who are you?" But Ethan let out a short laugh, then lifted his wine glass and said, "I can't understand how you can spend hours teaching people lines that won't even pay your bills." At that moment I smiled to ease the mood. But something inside me began to crack. He joked that I should teach accounting if I wanted to afford a new car. I didn't want much materially. But those remarks gradually made me feel small, not because of money, but because of the way he defined human worth. He equated value with profit. And because I didn't produce numbers, I became a shadow in my own home. Ethan was so good at making money that everyone in my family praised him. Every Thanksgiving, when we visited my parents, my mother would ladle extra of my father's favorite soup for him and whisper to me, "You're so lucky to have a successful husband like Ethan." I only smiled and went back to the kitchen. No one saw that I had turned down a chance to pursue a PhD at Yale so I could stay close to Ethan. The day I received the acceptance letter, I held that white sheet of paper with my heart sinking. Ethan said, "Be practical. You can get that degree later. My company is just getting started. I need someone by my side." And I chose him. I began to put aside professional conferences, refuse invitations to write, and teach only on short-term contracts. When Ethan opened a second office, I helped him manage schedules, design interiors, and prepare HR paperwork. Of course, no contract recorded my role. I did all of it as a proper wife, hoping that love would be the fair compensation that needed no signature. Over time, Ethan's company grew. He had a secretary, partners, long business trips to Miami, Houston, even New York. And me? I still went to campus, prepared lesson plans, cooked, cleaned, and quietly went upstairs to grade papers when Ethan came home late with an unfamiliar scent of cologne on his shirt collar. When I asked, he merely furrowed his brow. "Are you imagining this from novels again? Don't apply fiction to real life." I was silent, because I had grown used to it. But those repeated unnamed silences taught me to observe deeply. Literature trains you to notice small details that reveal character. The way someone avoids eye contact. The change in breathing. A phrase repeated, unconsciously. Ethan frequently repeated lines like, "You wouldn't understand. This is beyond your expertise. I'm the one who supports the family." He didn't know that each time, I recorded it in my memory. Not out of anger, but because I felt the need to keep them, like snippets of dialogue in a novel slowly taking shape. I once asked Ethan about the prenuptial agreement we signed before the wedding. I had read every clause carefully, and he insisted it was merely a formality to protect the company legally. "Trust me," he said, "I never intend to use it." I believed him. But a few years later, when I happened upon a copy in the safe, there were clauses I didn't recall signing. Strange provisions about assets and ownership made my chest drop. I didn't speak up. I quietly copied it and asked a lawyer friend to read it. She called me that night. "Haley, there are some irregularities. This version was altered after you signed. If it's used, you will lose everything." I sat in the dark kitchen for hours. Every sound in the house, the clock, the wind. Ethan's soft snoring upstairs sounded like scissors cutting away layers of trust. I was no longer the girl who waited for romantic morning wishes. But I was still Haley, the reader of thousands of stories, and now ready to write my own ending. Not with violence, not with rage, but with accumulated silence over many years and a memory that never forgot a single detail. I began to prepare. No one knew. No one asked. Ethan was too busy with new projects. And I remained the quiet wife with a stack of drafts in the corner of my study. The outward appearance still a dreamy literature professor, but inside a woman who had seen the true face of the man sleeping beside her each night. A naive bookworm. Ethan often used that phrase whenever he saw me holding a novel. Sometimes it was in the evenings when I sat on the sofa reading The Age of Innocence, sometimes in the novel, garden turning pages of Beloved, while he made loud calls about deals that I pretended not to care about. He didn't hide the sarcasm when he said it, and sometimes he seemed to enjoy it. In his eyes, my love of literature was a harmless pastime, frivolous and unworthy of serious consideration. "What do you even read that for? Real people, real money, that's life," Ethan said once when I was reading a critical essay on Toni Morrison. "No one cares about fictional characters. The world doesn't run on feelings." I didn't answer. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned that people who don't listen cannot understand the language of patience. The more successful he became, the more careless his confidence. His phone calls lasted for hours, even when I was nearby. One evening I was at the kitchen table, peeling potatoes for dinner while he casually talked about pumping funds through a third party. Pushing numbers ahead of the audit. Or hiding profits in offshore funds. I didn't inquire. I didn't react. I simply sliced an onion, my hands pausing for a beat when I heard a familiar partner's name. Jeffrey Klein, the man I had hosted with roasted beef and Italian red wine last year. "You don't need to whisper," I said softly. "I don't understand anyway." He laughed heartily, unguarded. "Exactly, because you only quote Jane Austen and brew chamomile tea." After that remark, I put down the knife and washed my hands, then went upstairs. That night I opened a new folder on my computer and named it Red Flags. In it, I began recording every conversation, each date, each name I overheard. I was no longer just a silent wife. I had become an observer. A secondary character in my own life story, who was starting to rewrite its structure. One morning, Ethan left for a meeting and forgot his phone on the kitchen counter. A message from Travis Finance flashed clearly. "Next time, route the transfer through the Miami account." The IRS is starting to watch transfers from Cayman. I took a screenshot. Then I put the phone back as if I had never touched it. Day by day, I took notes in a language only I would understand. Wednesday, 3:15 p.m. Ethan talked about restructuring the quarterly report, face calm. Call Nick, review Rosepine investment package. I even jotted quick notes on the back of utility bills when I couldn't get to a computer in time. Gradually, Ethan became more careless. He left financial files on the living room table and went to shower. There were transaction statements I had never seen in any tax filings. Some nights when he slept, I quietly slipped out of bed, went downstairs, and opened the spare laptop he used for work. No password. Apparently he never thought I would be curious. In a folder called Closed Contracts, I found a spreadsheet full of payments to companies I had never heard of. Many of the names looked like shell companies, no website, no real address, just account numbers and transfer codes. I saved each page to an external hard drive that I hid at the bottom of a tea tin in the kitchen cabinet. One day while tidying my study, Ethan came out of the bathroom, towel drying his hair. "What are you still doing?" he asked, lazily. "Finding a poem for next week's class." I answered without taking my eyes off the document folded on the desk. "It seems Whitman still has a lot to say about truth." Ethan waved his hand. "He knows nothing about money." I nodded, silently adding another line. On another occasion, when Ethan called someone named Simon, his voice was irritated. "No. Don't make the invoice real, draft it and leave it. Move the funds under the name Research Investment." "She won't look into it." I didn't react. I just bent to wash the dishes, ears storing every word. Not because I wanted to trap him, but because I refused to live without understanding who was steering the ship I was on. I began to study tax law not through textbooks but through Ethan's casual remarks. I looked up terms like offshore fund, round-trip transfers, shell company. Every night after grading, I spent an hour piecing together the fragments. The picture became clearer, and Ethan's role in it less ambiguous. I continued to play the devoted wife, asking about meals, hanging his coat, making coffee on time. But behind that gentle exterior was a dense archive of data, and the secret recordings I had made with a small device tucked in the vase beside the sofa. Once, when he called the company CFO, I managed to record the conversation in which they talked about softening a quarterly loss report by transferring funds from the parent company to a temporary subsidiary. After that, I sat down and transcribed the entire exchange by hand, including the tone, the pauses, the way he stressed emergency solution. Sketch. I was no longer afraid of what I heard. The more I understood, the calmer I became. Ethan had once taken my silence for incapacity. In truth, it was accumulation. The accumulation of someone who no longer needed to prove her worth to anyone. The accumulation of a person quietly transforming from a shadow into the core of a legal case that he had no idea was forming inside his own home. That night I planned only to walk into the kitchen for another glass of water, and then go back to finish the last part of Mrs. Dalloway. Ethan had gone to bed early, his phone set face down on the dining table as usual. Nothing special. Until it buzzed. I stepped past, and the light from the incoming message reflected a line on the lock screen. "I can't stop thinking about last night." The sender was Jessica. I froze. Not because of suspicion. Because that name was tied to years of youth that felt pure and forever safe. Jessica, the friend from high school. The one I'd passed grueling exams with, picked prom dresses with, the only bridesmaid at my wedding. In so many hard moments she had been the first person I turned to. Now the name lit up like an alarm. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't secretly unlock it, no need. A second message arrived seconds later, still displaying on the screen. "When I put my hand on your chest, my heart went wild. Haley will soon be out of the picture." I just want us to be real. I pulled a chair, sat at the table, and could hear the faucet dripping in the kitchen. My chest ached for a moment. Not from love betrayed, but because a part of me had suspected this for a long time, only I hadn't had the clear image to confront. From Jessica's evasive glances at a recent dinner, from the many times she claimed to be too busy when I suggested we meet, from the thinning goodnight and holiday messages, the phone kept buzzing. Another message. On Saturday you can use New York as an excuse. I'll rent an Airbnb on the West Side. I want to be with you all night. I stood, poured a glass of water, then quietly climbed the stairs to our bedroom. Ethan lay on his side, breathing evenly. The silver watch he usually wore rested on the nightstand, along with his wallet and car keys. In the dark, everything felt perfectly still. But inside me something rose to the surface. Like a body that had been held underwater finally finding a way to breathe. The next morning I woke earlier than usual. While Ethan was showering, I opened his computer. No password. In the corner of the screen, the messaging app showed unread notifications. I opened the calendar folder, then the photo folder, and finally the notes app synced from his phone. Each folder was a piece of a story I was no longer narrating. There were photos of Jessica and Ethan in a car, at a restaurant, in an unfamiliar apartment. There were notes: remember to book Vanessa, to make the transfer slip for the second house. There were hotel letters addressed to Ethan and Jessica thanking them for choosing the honeymoon suite. There were also audio clips of their conversations. Jessica said, in a honeyed voice, "She suspects nothing. Haley lives in the heads of those dusty characters, she couldn't possibly understand real life." Ethan laughed, his voice rough. "I thought you'd feel guilty." "Guilty for loving?" Jessica hissed. "If she couldn't keep his heart, who's to blame?" I copied the entire folder and put it on a small external hard drive that I hid in the bottom drawer of the bookcase. While Ethan was blow-drying his hair, I knocked softly on the bathroom door. "Are you taking your laptop with you today?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "No," he answered through the steam. "I'm just going to look at the site, no need." I nodded and stepped out. Still, the gentle wife he imagined, hair tied back. A light jacket, a packed lunch I had prepared. But inside me, I had turned onto a different road. I didn't interrogate him. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. My emotions had moved away from jealousy and collapse. They had become absolute focus, like when I dissect a play, reading every layer, probing every structure, tracing the author's concealed meanings. From that day on, I lived as if nothing had changed. But my schedule did shift. I tracked Ethan's movements. I logged destinations, times, appointments that matched Jessica's messages. Once he said he would be at a city council meeting. But I watched his car parked in front of a short-term rental, about a 30-minute drive from downtown. I sat in my car at a distance and took several photos. The door opened. Jessica stepped out with Ethan's coat around her shoulders, her hair still wet. I saved those photos as a draft email I never hit send on. I created a folder called Layered Truths. The first layer was deceit. The second, the financial fraud structure. The third, the plan to hide everything beneath the mask of family. One Friday afternoon, I happened to overhear Ethan on the phone with his personal lawyer. "I'm not sure she suspects anything. But prepare anyway. If necessary, we can claim she's showing signs of instability." I was watering the plants on the porch, the hose in my hand. He continued, "She doesn't have much separate property. This house is in my name, she won't have the means to fight back." I set the watering can down and walked into the kitchen. A line from Virginia Woolf flashed across my mind. "If they won't let you into their house, build your own room." I no longer hurt. I didn't seek forgiveness. I didn't try to explain why the two people I had trusted most chose such a cruel betrayal. What I needed was preparation. Not to save feelings, but to protect the truth. The truth Ethan never thought I could see through. The truth Jessica never imagined I was sharp enough to name. The truth that only a woman who had quietly watched from the shadows could gather, piece by piece, and turn into the sharpest weapon in a room full of lies. I met Olivia on a late autumn afternoon, a pewter sky covering the hill behind the cafe where we had studied through college. The place was the same, with its old brick floor and the warm scent of cinnamon curling around every table. She arrived in a dark brown coat, hair pulled low like before, but her eyes were different now, clear and deeper. I stood, smiled, forcing my heartbeat steady. "Haley." Olivia hugged me quickly and stepped back, her gaze sweeping my face. "I thought you'd forgotten this place." "I never did," I said, pulling a chair for her. "It always makes me feel steady." Lately, I've felt that steadiness slipping. She looked at me for a few more seconds, then nodded as if she understood. We ordered ginger tea and waffles and talked about ordinary things: school, work, the weather. I told her I was working on a new novel, a story about a woman living in a marriage where trust erodes bit by bit. "Sounds heavy on psychology," Olivia laughed. "Still, Haley with the novels and deep analysis." "Yeah, but this time..." I stopped. "I want the story to have a legal angle." The protagonist discovers her husband not only betrays her emotionally, but is involved in financial fraud. And I wonder, if it were real, what would a wife need to legally protect herself? Olivia set her cup down, fingers on the handle. "Are you asking in terms of a character? Or..." "I'm asking both." Silence fell across the table. In that moment I realized she had seen through the facade I had put up. And oddly, I didn't feel ashamed. I didn't feel weak. Only grateful that her eyes held no judgment. "Haley," Olivia said slowly. "We haven't seen each other in years, but I still remember the way you lecture on Medea, the sharpness of a woman pushed to the edge. Don't tell me you're writing a made-up novel. Tell me the truth." I tightened my grip on the cup, then opened my wallet and set a small USB drive on the table between us. "This has everything I've recorded over the past year. Financial files, audio recordings, photos, message histories, and a copy of the prenuptial agreement I signed, along with the version Ethan keeps in the safe. There are clauses I never saw before I signed." Olivia didn't touch the USB. She just sat, her eyes fixed on my face. "Do you want me to be your lawyer?" she asked, voice low and steady. "I need someone who understands the law and understands me. And I need someone who won't hesitate to face Ethan." "Then we'll start from the beginning," she said, opening her bag for a notebook and fountain pen. "Haley, I'll ask you some dry questions. Are you ready?" I nodded. She asked about the wedding date, the date the agreement was signed, who drafted it, who kept the original, whether I ever received a certified copy. She asked about suspicious financial transfers, wire moves, subsidiaries, fake invoices. I answered each point, closing my eyes at times to remember Ethan's tone, the way he held his glass when he mentioned supplemental fund. "Haley," she said after almost an hour, "some of this isn't just grounds for divorce. If what you say is true, Ethan may be committing federal crimes." I wasn't surprised. I'd had a vague sense of that from nights when Ethan talked on the phone in the study with the door open. "I need proof the agreement was altered after I signed it," I said. "I need legal rights to the house. And if possible, I want to protect myself before Ethan realizes I know everything." Olivia nodded. "I'll introduce you to a handwriting examiner and a forensic accountant. Everything has to be airtight. As for the agreement, if your copy predates and lacks those harmful clauses, the later version could be deemed forged." I sat still, listening to every word like a complex paragraph I had to parse to grasp every implication. "Ethan has his own lawyer," I said. "He's preparing a contingency plan in case I find anything." "Then, you need to be one step ahead," Olivia emphasized. "You must act proactively, not reactively. And Haley, there's something more important than the legal angle." She paused, looked up at me. How long have you endured this? I went quiet, then answered with the calmest voice I could muster. Long enough to understand that silence is no longer kindness, but complicity. Olivia closed her notebook and slid the USB gently into the folder at her side. We'll handle this step by step. And by the time Ethan realizes what's happening, you'll be standing on the side of the law, the evidence, and the truth. We left the cafe as a light rain began. The wind tugged at my hair and carried a feeling of relief I had never felt before. Of longer, simply the keeper of things no one could see. Now I had Olivia, an ally sharp enough to read between legal lines, and wise enough not to turn my story into a soulless lawsuit. This was no longer a flight. It was the first move of a calculated unmasking, quiet, careful, and relentless. 2 weeks after that meeting at the cafe, I sat in a small room with pale wooden floors. Late autumn sunlight slanted through tall windows and picked out dust motes drifting in the air. The room was so quiet I could hear Olivia's pen scrawl and the soft tapping of keys as Mark, the forensic accountant she had arranged to review my files, worked through everything I had brought. I looked at Mark. He was in his 40s, wore black-rimmed glasses, and carried the calm, measured manner of someone used to bad news framed as numbers. For an hour he barely looked up from the stacks of documents I had provided, only occasionally frowning and underlining passages on a photocopy. "Haley," Olivia said softly, "where do you keep the original?" "I put it in a private safe at the bank near campus," I answered, my hands folded in my lap. Mark nodded once. "Good. The copy you have and the version I'm looking at from Ethan, they don't match." At least 3 paragraphs were added after the original signing. Olivia leaned toward me. "Are you certain you never signed a version containing those clauses?" "Certain. I remember every line." Ethan insisted it was just a precautionary document that wouldn't affect property rights if we divorced. I read it thoroughly before I signed. But in the copy he keeps, there's a clause stating, in the event of divorce, the wife shall have no right to claim assets arising from investment activities or affiliated corporate interests. Mark ran a finger along that section, then looked back at Olivia. "Ethan's signature here shows signs of alteration. There's a clear ink variation beside it. That can be verified through forensic analysis." I sighed. Not from surprise, but from the sensation of finally opening a door at the far end of a house that had been leaning for a long time. Part of me was prepared, another part still recoiled at the memory of Ethan looking at me with tenderness, holding my hand beneath the wedding lights, saying, "I love you," in front of 100 people. Now he was ready to erase any value I had helped create, as if I were an extraneous line item on his balance sheet. "Maybe Ethan assumed you'd never dare to check," Olivia said, eyes on the papers. "Or rather, he believed you weren't sharp enough to suspect." I nodded slightly. He always disdained what didn't generate profit. Mark rotated his laptop so we could see. A chart appeared, arrows linking names of companies that sounded legitimate but had no clear substantive presence. Northlake Holdings, Benton Strategic, Pinecrest Developments. "This is the network through which Ethan moved funds," Mark explained. I checked registration numbers, director details, addresses. Most are shell entities. Routing money through so many layers is a classic method to avoid taxes or launder funds. Olivia frowned. "What's the likelihood he could face criminal charges?" "Fairly high, if we can demonstrate the transactions lacked transparency." "Haley, do you recall Ethan ever mentioning donations, charity payments, or market research expenses that seemed odd?" I froze. A June evening flashed in my head. Ethan was on the phone in the kitchen, pouring wine and speaking loudly to someone named Carter. "Just route the transfer to the Oak Ridge Charity Fund. Log it as community outreach. The IRS doesn't dig deeply into those spots." I recounted it all. Mark made immediate notes. Olivia skimmed the pile and said, "If you have recordings, we need to back them up and move them to encrypted drives." I said. Each recording has a transcript, date, and location. Olivia gave me a small smile. You've done very well, Haley. I stayed quiet for a moment. Well? Perhaps. But I saw nothing but the painful dismantling of a marriage, of trust, of everything that had made me endure those cold winters in that house. I used to think if I just lived kindly, things would fall into place, I said. Staring out at the window rhymed with dead leaves. Now I see kindness without boundaries just makes it easier for others to remove you from the equation. Olivia placed a hand lightly on the back of my hand. You're setting new boundaries. That isn't easy. Mark closed his laptop. I'll prepare a full report within a week. After that, I suggest we consult a financial crimes advisor. But the final decision is yours. Pursue a straightforward divorce, or expand this into criminal allegations. I nodded. Until he realizes what's happening, I want to keep my role the same. The quiet wife, the gentle teacher. But when the time comes, no one will recognize the woman they thought weak. Olivia looked at me not as a longtime friend now, but as an ally ready to go into battle with me with the law, with evidence, and with the resolve of a woman who spent too long living in someone else's shadow. Every morning I still made Ethan his coffee, placed the white mug beside the toast, and listened to him sum up deals in a quick, casual way. I nodded and smiled at the right moments, even asked questions like a concerned spouse. In his eyes I remained the gentle Haley, absorbed in novels and a small classroom. He had no idea that every action I took was calculated to preserve the role. Olivia messaged me regularly through an encrypted app. She'd remind me, do not change your routine. Don't let him notice anything strange. I obeyed. Days were lectures and office hours. Evenings cooking and market runs. Small bouquets on the private table. The family picture stayed intact. Only beneath that calm surface was a plan taking shape. One late night, when Ethan was asleep, I logged onto my laptop and connected with Olivia and a federal agent over a secure line. The man's voice at the other end was hoarse but clear. Mrs. Monroe, what you've provided is sufficient to open a preliminary inquiry. But we need direct proof that he instructed the transfers. I sent the latest recording in which Ethan spoke with the CFO, emphasizing just route it through Northlake. Don't let the girl see the invoices. The agent paused, then replied, this is the piece we need. But you must keep complete secrecy. If he suspects he could dissipate assets before we can act. I shut down the laptop and sat in the dark. Hearing Ethan's steady breathing from upstairs, I felt like a stranger in my own house. But I wasn't afraid. I knew my part, the seemingly naive wife, the woman who didn't know much, maybe a little foolish. One morning Ethan adjusted his tie and said, Haley, I'm planning a big party for our 10-year anniversary. It needs to be grand, local press will be there. I smiled faintly. Good idea, I'll pick a beautiful dress. He kissed my forehead and left. That night I texted Olivia, this will be the stage. She called back, decisive, perfect. We have time to prepare. From then on we met weekly in Olivia's private office. Maps of seating plans, guest lists, and step-by-step scripts lay on the table. Olivia planned. When he stands to toast, make sure everyone can see his face. Don't interrupt too early, let his arrogance show itself. Then unfold the evidence. I nodded, my mouth dry. What if he reacts violently? We have lawyers, witnesses, and the authorities waiting for the signal. Haley, you are not alone. I exhaled and looked over the stack of files. The original prenuptial agreement, the forensic report confirming the altered version, and Mark's financial analysis turned into diagrams. Everything was backed up in 3 places, one copy submitted directly to the IRS. In the days that followed, I performed my role so well. Ethan grew careless. He flaunted more. One evening he poured wine, leaned back on the sofa, and boasted about a new deal. Jeffrey thinks I'm reckless, but I call it creative. People won't do it. I will. That's how you make money. I tilted my head and said, "You really are brilliant. I can't begin to understand." He touched my lips with his glass. "See? I always say it. You're too innocent for these things." Each phrase carved itself into the evidence in my mind. He had been building his own cage with his words. At dinner with his parents, he bragged about the party plan. "We must book the city's finest hotel. Hire a celebrity chef. I want everyone to see how successful we are." His mother turned to me. "Haley, you must pick an elegant gown. A woman as fortunate as you should shine." I squeezed her hand and answered, "I will prepare thoroughly." A strange feeling rose up inside me. She had no idea what lay behind her son's smile. And I, the woman she thought lucky, held the key that would change everything. The night before the event, Olivia came by. She entered the living room with a serious look. "Haley, here are the power of attorney and the divorce papers prepared. Tomorrow, when you reveal things, I will appear with my team. Everything must be synchronized." I sat and felt my hands tremble slightly. "Olivia, sometimes I wonder, do we have to make it public like that? Before friends and family?" Olivia leaned closer. "You could choose a quiet route. But if you do, Ethan will spin it, smear you, and keep manipulating things. You need him to see right where he thinks he's most powerful that you hold the full board." I closed my eyes and let a long breath pass. When I opened them, I looked straight at Olivia. "Tomorrow, it ends." She put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed. "The end of a disguise, and the start for you." That night I opened the closet and chose the navy dress Ethan had once praised as suitable for a modest literature professor. I smiled at my reflection. Tomorrow, this dress would be the last shell I put on before I took it off forever. In the drawer I neatly placed the USB with the evidence, the backup hard drive, and a copy of the original agreement sealed in plastic. Everything was ready. The bedroom clock ticked steadily. I lay down beside Ethan and listened as he mumbled about people who would attend, about contracts to be signed at the party. I did not answer. I turned my face away and gripped the edge of the sheet. Tomorrow, the chandelier in the banquet room would shine bright, the wine would be poured full, and laughter would ring out. And in the moment that seemed most perfect, I would tear open the curtain he had hung for years and expose his true face to everyone. The Grand Hill Hotel glittered with lights as we entered the private banquet room prepared for the celebration. Long tables were draped in white linens, roses arranged in crystal vases, and a live band played soft jazz. Ethan held my hand as if we were a happy couple. He smiled, shook hands with partners, embraced a few old friends, and I simply smiled politely, the familiar role of the demure wife. When the guests had settled and the wine was poured, Ethan stood at the center of the table. He raised his glass, eyes sparkling with pride. "Over the past 10 years, he began, my friends warned me I was taking a risk marrying a literature teacher. They said she only reads books, lives in fantasy, and couldn't understand real work." He paused and turned to me with a half smile. And perhaps they were right. But because of that, I was never questioned. For 10 years I had absolute freedom to build this success. So, raise a glass to my gentle wife, the most worthless companion I've ever had. The room fell silent. A few strained laughs echoed and died quickly. I heard the soft clink of cutlery on plates like tiny pinpricks in the tense air. I set my glass down and rose slowly. All eyes turned toward me, some curious, some uneasy. I smiled gently and placed a thick file on the table in front of Ethan. "Thank you for that speech," I said, my voice steady. "But perhaps tonight is also an appropriate moment for me to say a few words." Ethan frowned. Haley, you don't need to. Sit down. I kept my smile and opened the file. 2 agreements lay before the room. The original, with a clear signature and date, and a revised version, with clauses unfavorable to me. I held both up so those nearest could see. This is the prenuptial agreement I signed 10 years ago, and this is the copy Ethan keeps in his safe, I said. If we divorced, that other version states I have no claim to any assets. But the original shows the opposite. The differences are not accidental. They were added after I signed. Color drained from Ethan's face. And he reached for the papers. But I pulled them back and placed them close to me. My voice lowered. And since he just mentioned absolute freedom, I think everyone here deserves to know what that freedom includes. I opened my phone and hit send. Instantly the room filled with notification sounds, vibrations, chimes, beeps in rapid succession. Guests bowed over their screens, and the air erupted into gasps and whispered amazement. Messages, photos, and suggestive exchanges between Ethan and Jessica, the friend who had once stood beside me at my wedding, now appeared on phones across the room. A young woman covered her mouth, eyes full of pity as she looked at me. Some of Ethan's partners stared wide-eyed, exchanging incredulous whispers. At the far end, a longtime friend of his shook his head and set his wine down with a look of disappointment. "What the hell is this?" Ethan roared, his face flushed, turning toward me. "What have you done?" I looked him straight in the eye. "I only showed everyone what you left on your phone." His mother, seated near the end of the table, opened her phone with shaking hands. Tears welled in her eyes. She looked up at Ethan in horror. "Ethan, you betrayed your wife, and with Jessica?" The room erupted in chaotic murmurs. Several men pushed back their chairs and distanced themselves from Ethan as if they feared contagion. Business partners glanced at one another, heavy with implied calculations. I stood unmoved, breathing even. You thought I was too naive to notice. But over 10 years I listened, recorded, and observed. I know the numbers you hid, the shell companies you set up, the things you whispered to Jessica. And tonight I will not remain silent. Ethan ground his teeth. You ruin me in front of our guests? What do you think you accomplish? I returned the agreements to the table, eyes never leaving his. I'm not ruining you, Ethan. You have been doing that, yourself. You just didn't expect me to have the courage to reveal it. In that instant, no one in the room dared fake a laugh. No one pretended to lift a glass to change the mood. All eyes were fixed on the proud man now bound by the careless evidence he had left behind. The soundscape of the room shifted completely. The jazz from the live band felt out of place, and then fell silent when a member signaled to stop. Only the scrape of chairs, whispers, and harsh, disbelieving hisses remained. Those who had sat near Ethan quickly moved away, fearful that proximity alone might embroil them. Jeffrey, Ethan's closest partner, laid down his glass heavily and stood up. He said nothing, put on his coat, and left. Others followed awkwardly, faces cold, avoiding eye contact with Ethan. Footsteps thudded across the wooden floor, each step sealing a decisive turning away. Ethan's mother sat, motionless for a long moment, her gaze vacant as she stared at her phone. Proud for years of her son and convinced I was merely someone who benefited from his success, she now watched that image implode. She took off the pearl necklace Ethan had given her for the anniversary and slammed it down on the table with a harsh clack. "This does not belong to me," she said, voice trembling but firm. Then she stood, grabbed her bag, and left. His father, usually reserved, followed with a face full of sorrow. Ethan tried to call after them, but his voice broke. At that moment, a female voice rang from the back of the room. "Wait, everyone's getting this wrong." Jessica entered in a bright red dress, her face pale. She approached the table, holding her phone with trembling hands. "Those messages, they were a joke, we didn't mean it that way." A woman seated to my left, an old school friend, stood and raised her phone. A joke. With these photos? With these private arrangements? Her voice was hard, and many heads nodded in agreement. Jessica took a step forward, pleading. Haley, you know we were friends. I looked at her calmly. You don't secretly see someone else's husband, Jessica. And you surely do not use friendship to cover a betrayal. A low buzz of disapproval spread across the room. People who had once shaken Jessica's hand now turned away. A man flung a napkin down. I believed you, Jessica. Turns out you were just riding on someone else's success. Jessica retreated, her expression shattered. She grasped at a friend's shoulder. But he pushed her off and walked away without a word. While the room swirled into disorder, I remained standing, my hand resting lightly on the file. The smile on my face was not antagonistic. It was proof that I had chosen this path deliberately. I did not need to shout or slam a fist, the truth was doing the work. Ethan spun, ripping the napkin from his lap, and roared, like an animal cornered. You're all insane. Haley, you don't understand what you've done. His voice echoed through the banquet room, thick with tension. Some guests rose, others sidled away, many simply slid back in their chairs with wary eyes. Ethan's gaze shot angrily across the room, his fists clenched, jaw tight, and then he strode toward the exit as if to flee the suffocating space as quickly as possible. I stayed seated, my fingertips brushing the papers I had gathered, watching him disappear down the hallway. Just as the heavy double doors were about to close behind him, the sound of firm footsteps reached the room. 3 men in gray suits entered. The overhead lights reflected off the brass badges on their chests. One man, his hair streaked with gray and bearing a composed, stern face, stepped to the center, opened his inner jacket pocket, and pulled out a document stamped with a deep red seal. His voice carried clearly across the room, as the others moved to block the exits. Ethan stopped dead. What the hell? His face registered disbelief. I'm Special Agent Thomas Garrett with the Financial Crimes Division, the man announced. Under a search and arrest warrant duly authorized, we are here to take you into custody on charges of tax evasion, money laundering, falsification of financial records, and conspiracy to conceal the source of funds through a network of shell companies. The whispering diminished and then stopped. Nobody dared breathe hard. A server carrying a tray of drinks froze, hands shaking and causing glasses to clink. Ethan looked around, stepping back. You've got it wrong. This is a private party. I didn't do anything wrong. I have lawyers, and I will sue you. Agent Garrett did not flinch. He held up a pair of open handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Any statement you make may be used in federal court. If you intend to speak here, ensure your attorney is present. This is fabrication. Ethan nearly screamed. Haley, say something. Are you siding with these people? For what? I stood. The entire room watched in silence, as if every movement now depended on a single word. I stepped forward and stopped about 3 paces from Ethan, meeting his undisguised astonishment eye to eye. Because I listened, I said slowly, enunciating each word. Night after night you spoke on the phone thinking I didn't understand. Morning after morning, you left documents scattered on the table thinking I wasn't clever enough to read them. You joked that I lived among dusty fictional characters. I heard everything, Ethan. And you taught me to remember. Ethan tried to step toward me, but an agent at his side put a hand out to restrain him. His face twitched. Who have you conspired with? Are you trying to destroy me? No, I answered. I don't need to destroy you. You've been doing that for a long time. I'm simply pulling back the curtain so everyone can see. Garrett signaled. The other 2 agents moved in, quickly forcing Ethan's hands behind his back and snapping on the cuffs. The metallic clink of the lock rang out like the final seal on a drama that had gone on too long. Ethan struggled, but not as fiercely as I had imagined. In a room full of staring faces and stunned silence, his power revealed itself to be oddly fragile. "You are making a grave mistake. I'm a major shareholder, I have lawyers, I have influence on the board," he shouted. One of his old friends, who had already pulled back into the corner, shook his head softly. "Not anymore, Ethan." I stepped back a pace and watched him led past the banquet tables. His eyes flicked to where his mother stood by the doorway. She said nothing. She only stood upright, gripping her wallet so tight the knuckles bleached white. Her face was colder than I had ever seen it. Jessica had slipped away at some point. The people who had clustered around Ethan now dispersed, standing separate and scattered. Nobody dared meet his eyes. As he was led past me in handcuffs, his gaze landed on me for one long, suspended moment. His voice went low and hoarse. "Why you, Haley? Why did you do it this way?" I looked at him without blinking. "Because you thought I didn't know. And I want you to understand silence does not mean blindness. I was simply waiting for the right moment." Agent Garrett gave me a slight nod as they left the room. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud. In the room, the exhalations mingled with chairs being dragged, and the murmurs starting to swell again like waves after a storm. But no one spoke to me. No one asked me why. They understood. And perhaps, somewhere in a few of those glances, I saw respect. I turned back to the table, picked up the file, straightened my dress strap, and walked toward the side door where Olivia and 2 attorneys from her office waited. No applause necessary, no handshakes required. No one stood to escort me. I didn't need any of it. What I had sought was not approval, but truth. And tonight I had brought it into the light, not out of vengeance, but to clear the house I had once called home. Not to pack and leave, as many might have assumed, but to step into a space that was mine both legally and, in a very particular way, spiritually. Olivia had handled all the ownership transfer paperwork before the party even started. The house was now entirely in my name, free from the shady clauses Ethan had inserted into the forged agreement. I opened the door with a new key and walked into the kitchen that had been the place where I silently listened to whispered phone calls, folded towels, brewed tea, and set the table while a man across from me did not bother to look up from his screen. No files were spread across the table, no foreign perfume lingered in a corner. Only the warm smell of wood and pale sunlight, filtering through the curtains, calm and clean as a fresh beginning. I spent a week clearing every drawer, every bookcase, every corner, dusting and removing traces that no longer belonged. I kept the books I loved, old photos without any false shadows, and an old guitar I used to play when I was sad. On my first morning back in the classroom, I entered wearing a chestnut coat, hair tied neatly, carrying a bag full of syllabi and an unbound manuscript. Students were already waiting, mostly familiar faces, and a few nodded as I passed. I opened a window to let the early autumn air in. "We're starting with a slightly unusual syllabus this term," I said, my voice not loud but steady. "Along with literature, I want to invite you to explore something equally important: how to read your own life. Not just sentences, but the signals people often miss." A student in the front raised his hand. "Are you going to teach personal finance in a literature course, Professor?" I smiled. "Not exactly. But I will teach you how to spot when something in a story doesn't add up, both in fiction and in life." After class, a group of female students asked about the supplemental course I had mentioned. I led them to a small room, the college set aside for extracurriculars. I set up a whiteboard and wrote, "Literature and Finance" in confident strokes. "This is not a get-rich class," I said, "but a course on recognizing when someone is trying to manipulate you with words, contracts, or sweet promises." We started with simple documents, utility bills, lease agreements, bank statements, and analyzed how language can be used to hide obligations. How a small clause can change the entire meaning. I taught them to read between the lines, not just with legal eyes, but with the instincts of someone who had been dismissed as weak. In quiet evenings, I sat at my desk writing each chapter of the book I had been nurturing since I first began, recording the signs. The book is called Silent Notes: How to Read the Red Flags, a simple title, but to me it held the whole journey. I did not tell my story in a tone of victimhood. I wrote tools, questions to ask when something felt off. Basic steps to protect oneself in marriage, contracts, and finances. I wrote about how women are often taught to keep the peace, to yield, to accept, and rarely taught how to say no, how to preserve evidence, how to read a legal sentence as if it were a disguised poem. When the manuscript was done, I sent it to Olivia first. She read it through a whole weekend and called me with one sentence: "This book will help many women hold their heads high." A month later, I was invited to speak at a workshop sponsored by a nonprofit that supports women through divorce and rebuilding their lives. I stood on a small stage under warm lights, facing more than 200 women of all ages. Many had just left marriages like mine, many were still finding their way out. I didn't recount every detail of my past. I asked, who here has been told they are too weak to understand the serious stuff? Dozens of hands went up. I looked at them and smiled. I thought that too. But weakness is only a temporary costume. We only need one moment to strip it off. As I left the hall, an older woman approached me, clutching the book with colored sticky notes. She gripped my hand hard. "Thank you," she said. "For what you wrote, it made me re-examine 30 years beside someone who never saw me as a person." That night, I didn't turn on the lights. I went out to the balcony where an old wooden chair Ethan used to mock as outdated sat. I sat, held a hot cup of tea, and looked down at the quiet street. Everything was still: no rushing footsteps, no competing voices, just a woman living truly as herself. The house was the same old house, but the space inside it had changed. And I, who had been pushed to the margins of the story, had stepped forward as the writer of the next chapter. Not to retaliate, not to condemn, but to claim the place I had always deserved. The next morning, when I stood in front of the blackboard, the chalk still holding its faint smell, my shoulders felt lighter. I was no longer the wife who had been underestimated, no longer the woman sidelined by someone else's success. I was a professor, an author, a mentor, and a survivor. And most importantly, the only person with the right to write the rest of my life in the language I had quietly learned during 10 years of silence. My story ends here, but I believe each listener will take a different feeling or thought away. Maybe you were Haley brushed aside for years, holding on because you thought family mattered more than unnamed wounds. Maybe you are standing where I once stood, at a crossroads between silence and speech, between staying and daring to begin again. I do not tell this story to solicit pity or hatred. I tell it so we might understand that gentleness is not weakness. And sometimes awakening that follows the most painful break is the true beginning of freedom. Because sometimes, after losing everything, we finally recognize what is truly ours. If my story touched you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share what you take away, or simply how it made you feel. Every comment is part of a journey of healing and mutual understanding among people who once felt like strangers. And if you're interested in more everyday but profound stories about family, human nature, and unexpected twists in domestic life, please subscribe to the channel. More stories will follow, not just to tell, but to walk alongside each other, reminding us that any one of us can be the main character in the work of redefining love, self-worth, and quiet strength.